The bullet tore through Sarah Hartwell's shoulder, just as the stagecoach hit a rut in the dusty California road, and she knew immediately that her careful plans to reach Oroville unnoticed had just shattered like glass. The pain came a heartbeat later, white-hot and stealing her breath, and she pressed her hand against the wound through the fabric of her emerald traveling dress as the other passengers screamed, and the driver shouted something she couldn't quite hear over the ringing in her ears. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and sticky, but she kept her face turned toward the window, refusing to let anyone see the tears that threatened to fall. The outlaws had come out of nowhere, their faces covered with bandanas, their guns blazing in the August heat of 1883. They had taken the strong box, the mail, and whatever valuables the passengers had been foolish enough to carry in plain sight. Sarah had hidden her mother's locket inside her corset, and the outlaws had missed it in their hasty robbery. They had also missed the fact that one of their wild shots had found her flesh, or perhaps they simply hadn't cared. By the time the stage lurched back into motion, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of hoofbeats behind them, Sarah was struggling to stay conscious. The elderly woman sitting across from her finally noticed the blood. "Oh my stars, you're hurt. Driver, stop the stage. This woman needs help." Sarah wanted to tell her to be quiet, that she would be fine, that they should just keep going until they reached Oroville. But her tongue felt thick in her mouth, and the world was starting to tilt in strange ways. The stage did stop, though, and there was a great deal of commotion that seemed to come from very far away. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying on something soft, and the ceiling above her was made of rough wooden planks. The pain in her shoulder had intensified to the point where she wanted to scream, but she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood and stayed silent. Voices floated from somewhere nearby, male voices, deep and concerned. "She's lost a fair amount of blood," one voice said. "That bullet needs to come out soon or infection will set in. Is Doc Miller on his way?" Another voice, this one younger, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone who had spent time in Texas. "Sent Jimmy running for him soon as we brought her in. Should be here any minute." Sarah tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. A wave of dizziness crashed over her, and she fell back against the pillow with a soft gasp. Immediately, footsteps approached, and a weathered face appeared above her, belonging to a woman of perhaps 50 years with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Easy now, dear. You're at the boarding house in Oroville. You're safe here, the doctor is coming." "No," Sarah managed to whisper. "No doctor." The woman's brow furrowed. "Child, you've been shot. That bullet needs to come out." "No," Sarah repeated, her voice stronger now despite the pain. She tried again to sit up, and this time she managed it, though the room spun wildly around her. "No doctor. I'll be fine. Just need to rest." "That's foolishness talking," the woman said firmly. "You'll die if that wound isn't treated properly." Before Sarah could respond, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, and a portly man with spectacles and a black medical bag entered the room. Dr. Miller, she presumed. He had the brisk, efficient manner of someone who had seen too many emergencies to waste time on pleasantries. "Let's have a look at that shoulder," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. "Madam, if you could help her remove her dress so I can examine the wound properly." "No." The word came out sharp and final. Sarah clutched her dress tighter around herself, ignoring the way the movement made fresh blood seep through the fabric. "I won't remove my dress." Dr. Miller paused, his eyebrows rising. "Madam, I understand modesty, but this is a medical emergency. I need to see the wound to treat it properly." "I said no." Sarah's voice was steady now, strengthened by desperation and fear. "You can work around the dress or you can leave. Those are your choices." The doctor exchanged glances with the boarding house proprietress, Mrs. Henderson, as Sarah would later learn her name to be. "Madam, be reasonable. I've been a doctor for 25 years. I assure you I've seen it all, and there's nothing improper about a medical examination." But Sarah was already shaking her head, her free hand gripping the neckline of her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't remove the dress. If she did, they would see the scars, the marks that told a story she had traveled 800 miles to escape. They would see the evidence of what her late husband had done, the pattern of old burns and cuts that covered her back and sides, and they would ask questions she couldn't answer. Wouldn't answer. "I won't remove my dress," she repeated, and there was something in her tone, some edge of barely controlled panic that made the doctor step back. "Then I can't help you," he said, not unkindly, but with the firmness of a man who knew his limitations. "I'm sorry, but I won't risk making the injury worse by working blind. If you change your mind, send for me." He left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, and Mrs. Henderson followed him, leaving Sarah alone in the small room with her pain and her secrets. She lay back down, pressing her hand harder against the wound, feeling the wet warmth of blood soaking through her dress. Perhaps she would die here, in this strange town where no one knew her name or her story. Perhaps that would be easier than living with the memories. She must have dozed, because the next thing she knew, the light coming through the window had shifted from afternoon gold to evening amber. The pain had become a constant throb, almost familiar now, and she felt cold despite the summer heat. Footsteps on the stairs again, lighter this time, and then a soft knock on the door. "Madam," a man's voice, the younger one she had heard earlier, with that Texas drawl. "Madam, Doc Miller asked me to check on you, see if you changed your mind about treatment." "Go away," Sarah said, but her voice came out weak and thready. The door opened anyway, and a man stepped into the room. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore denim pants, scuffed boots, and a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. His eyes were a surprising shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the ocean, and they regarded her with a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Name's Jack Anderson," he said, stopping just inside the doorway. "I drive freight between here and Sacramento. I was downstairs when they brought you in." "I don't care who you are," Sarah said. "I'm not removing my dress for anyone." Jack held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not asking you to. But madam, you're bleeding pretty badly, and Doc Miller says that bullet needs to come out. If you won't let him examine you properly, you're going to die, simple as that." "Then I'll die." The words came out flat and final. Jack was quiet for a moment, studying her with those storm cloud eyes. Then he did something unexpected. He walked to the chair beside the bed, turned it around backward, and sat down, resting his arms on the back of it. "What are you running from?" he asked softly. The question hit her like a physical blow. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. I've seen that look before on horses that have been broken wrong, beaten until they're more scared of people than anything else in the world. You've got that same look in your eyes. Someone hurt you bad, didn't they? And whatever they did, it left marks you don't want anyone to see." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right, I don't. But I know this. If you die in this room because you're too afraid to let a doctor help you, then whoever hurt you wins. They'll have killed you just as sure as if they'd put that bullet in you themselves." The truth of his words cut deeper than any blade. Sarah turned her face toward the wall, unable to look at him, unable to bear the kindness in his expression. "Please leave." Jack stood up, and she thought he would go, but instead he walked to the door and called down the stairs. "Mrs. Henderson, could you fetch some clean water, bandages, and whiskey? The good stuff, not that rotgut from the saloon." "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, turning back to look at him. "I'm going to go get Doc Miller," Jack said, "and you're going to let him treat that wound. But here's what's going to happen first. Mrs. Henderson is going to help you out of that dress and into a nightgown, something loose that the doc can work around. She's not going to ask you any questions about what she sees, because I'm going to ask her not to. And then I'm going to stand outside this door while the doc removes that bullet and stitches you up. I'll be right there the whole time, just on the other side of that door, making sure nothing happens that shouldn't." "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Jack met her eyes, and his expression was so earnest it made her chest ache. "Because once upon a time, my little sister needed help, and nobody stepped up to give it to her. I was off driving freight, thought she was safe at home with our parents. Turned out her husband was beating her senseless, and she was too ashamed to tell anyone. By the time I found out, it was too late. She died from her injuries before I could get her to a doctor." The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain and understanding. Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she had built to keep the world at bay. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Me too," Jack said quietly. "Every single day. But madam, I'll be damned if I stand by and let another woman die because she's too scared to ask for help. So what do you say? Will you let us help you?" Sarah closed her eyes, fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The pain was getting worse, spreading from her shoulder down her arm and across her chest. She knew Jack was right. She knew that stubborn pride and old shame would kill her if she let them. And somewhere, deep in the part of her that still wanted to live, she found the courage to nod. "Okay," she breathed. "But you promise. You'll stay right outside that door, I promise," Jack said solemnly. "Take your time. There's no rush. Mrs. Henderson will help you get ready, and I'll go fetch the doc. I won't let anything happen to you that you don't want to happen. You have my word." He left then, and true to his word, Mrs. Henderson appeared a few minutes later with the supplies Jack had requested. The older woman's face was composed, professional, as she helped Sarah sit up and began the painful process of removing the blood-soaked dress. When the fabric pulled away from Sarah's skin, revealing the patchwork of old scars that covered her back and sides, Mrs. Henderson made no sound of shock or disgust. Her hands remained gentle and steady as she bathed the wounds with warm water and helped Sarah into a clean white nightgown that buttoned up the front. "Your husband?" Mrs. Henderson asked quietly, the first and only question she would ask. "Late husband," Sarah corrected, her voice barely audible. "He died 3 months ago. That's why I came west, to start over somewhere no one knew me or my story." Mrs. Henderson's hand came to rest briefly on Sarah's uninjured shoulder, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "Well, you're in Oroville now, dear, and we take care of our own here. Whatever happened before, it stays in the past if that's what you want. By the time Dr. Miller returned, Sarah was propped up against the pillows, the nightgown arranged to give him access to her wounded shoulder while still preserving her modesty. And true to his word, Jack Anderson was standing just outside the open door, his back to the room, his broad shoulders blocking the view of anyone who might try to pass by. "I'm ready," Sarah called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Doctor." Miller entered with his medical bag, and Jack spoke without turning around. "Doc, Mrs. Henderson is going to stay in the room as a chaperone. You do what you need to do to help Miss Hartwell, but you be respectful about it. Understood, of course, Doctor," Miller said, sounding slightly affronted but not particularly surprised by the unusual arrangement. He approached the bed and examined Sarah's shoulder with professional detachment. The bullet went clean through, which is good news. Missed the bone from what I can tell. But it's still bleeding and the wound needs to be cleaned and stitched. This is going to hurt. I know, Sarah said. She had experienced far worse pain at her husband's hands, though she didn't say that aloud. Dr. Miller poured whiskey over the wound, and Sarah bit down on the leather strap. Mrs. Henderson had thoughtfully provided, her eyes squeezing shut against the burning agony. Through it all, she could hear Jack's voice from the doorway, calm and steady. "You're doing fine," he said, though he couldn't see her. "Just breathe through it. It'll be over soon." The sound of his voice became an anchor in the storm of pain, something to focus on besides the needle piercing her flesh, the tug of thread pulling her torn skin back together. She didn't know this man, had no reason to trust him beyond his words and the story of his sister. But somehow his presence made everything more bearable. When it was finally over, Dr. Miller stepped back and surveyed his work with satisfaction. "Clean stitches, no signs of infection yet. You'll need to rest for at least 2 weeks, and someone should change those bandages daily. No strenuous activity, and if you develop a fever, send for me immediately." "I'll make sure she follows your instructions," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "She can stay here as long as she needs to recover. Room and board are $4 a week." Sarah's heart sank. She had money enough to get her started in a new town, but 2 weeks of room and board would eat into her carefully hoarded savings significantly. Still, what choice did she have? "That's very kind of you," she said quietly, "Doctor." Miller packed up his bag and left, and Mrs. Henderson followed him downstairs to see him out, leaving Sarah alone with Jack still standing guard at the door. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," Sarah finally said, her voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "You didn't have to do all that for me." Jack turned around then, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes found hers, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Yes, I did," he said simply. "Like I said, I wasn't there when my sister needed someone. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere until I know you're going to be all right. You don't even know me." "No," Jack agreed. "But I'd like to if you'll let me." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. Jack seemed to understand that she needed time, needed space to process everything that had happened. He tipped his hat to her, a small gesture of respect. "I'll be around town for the next few days," he said. "Got a freight run to Sacramento scheduled for the end of the week, but until then, I'm staying at the hotel down the street. If you need anything at all, you just send word and I'll come running. That's a promise." He left before she could respond, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs. Sarah lay back against the pillows, her shoulder throbbing but the pain more manageable now that the bullet was out and the wound was properly cleaned. Outside her window, the California sky was deepening from amber to purple, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. She had come to Oroville to disappear, to become someone new, someone without a past full of pain and fear. But lying there in that boarding house room, her life saved by the kindness of strangers and the unexpected intervention of a freight driver with storm cloud eyes, Sarah began to wonder if perhaps she had found something else entirely, something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of August heat that made the air shimmer and turned the dusty streets into rivers of reflected sunlight. Sarah woke to find Mrs. Henderson beside her bed with a breakfast tray containing eggs, toast, and coffee. "How are you feeling, dear?" the older woman asked, setting the tray on the small table beside the bed. "Sore," Sarah admitted, pushing herself carefully into a sitting position. "But better than last night." "That's good. You've got color back in your cheeks at least. Dr. Miller said that was a good sign. Mrs. Henderson fussed with the pillows, arranging them to support Sarah's back. Now, I need to change those bandages, but first you should eat something. You need your strength. Sarah ate slowly, finding that her appetite was better than she had expected. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the coffee strong and hot. As she ate, Mrs. Henderson busied herself gathering fresh bandages and a basin of clean water. That young man, Mr. Anderson, he stopped by this morning, Mrs. Henderson said casually, too casually. Asked after you. Wanted to know if you'd had a good night and if there was anything you needed. Sarah felt her cheeks warm and she focused intently on her toast. That was kind of him. He's a good man, that one. Been driving freight through Oroville for about 3 years now. Always polite, always respectful. Unlike some of the rougher types we get coming through here. Mrs. Henderson began unwrapping the bandages on Sarah's shoulder, her touch gentle but efficient. Never seen him take such an interest in anyone before, though. Usually keeps to himself, does his business and moves on. He told me about his sister, Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Henderson nodded, her expression turning sad. Terrible thing, that. He doesn't talk about it much, but you can see it weighs on him. Some men carry their grief like a stone around their neck and it pulls them under. Others, like Mr. Anderson, they carry it like a torch, lighting the way so others don't stumble in the same darkness. The fresh bandages were clean and white against Sarah's skin, and the wound looked better in the daylight, less angry and swollen. Mrs. Henderson helped her into a clean nightgown, one of her own that she had altered to fit Sarah's smaller frame. You rest now, Mrs. Henderson instructed. I'll check on you again at lunchtime. If you need anything before then, you just ring that bell on the table. The day passed slowly. Sarah dozed on and off, her body demanding rest to heal. When she was awake, she lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. She had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago, her husband barely cold in his grave, carrying nothing but a small trunk of clothes, and every penny she had managed to hide from him over the years of their marriage. Daniel Hartwell had been a respected banker in St. Louis, a pillar of the community with a charming smile and impeccable manners. No one would have believed that behind closed doors, he was a monster who found pleasure in causing pain, who burned his wife with cigars when she displeased him, who beat her until she could barely stand if dinner was late, or the house wasn't clean enough. Sarah had thought about leaving 1,000 times, but where could she go? She had no family, no money of her own, no skills beyond keeping house. And Daniel had made it clear that if she ever tried to leave, he would find her and kill her. She had believed him. Then, 3 months ago, Daniel had died. A heart attack, the doctor said, sudden and quick. Sarah had stood at his funeral, dressed in widow's black, and felt nothing but relief. She had waited the appropriate amount of time, playing the grieving widow for the neighbors and Daniel's business associates. And then, as soon as she could without raising suspicion, she had packed her things and bought a ticket west. California had seemed like a good choice. Far enough from St. Louis that no one would know her story, large enough that she could disappear into the crowd. She had planned to reach San Francisco, to find work as a seamstress or perhaps a housekeeper for a respectable family. But fate, in the form of a stagecoach robbery, had deposited her in Oroville instead. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Madam, it's Jack Anderson. Mrs. Henderson said I could come up for a quick visit if you're feeling up to it." Sarah's heart did a strange little flutter in her chest. "Come in." Jack entered, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable in the small room. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his shirt pressed and his hair still damp from what must have been a recent wash. He held a book in his other hand. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I just thought, well, lying in bed all day can get mighty boring, and I thought maybe you'd like something to read." He held out the book, and Sarah took it carefully. It was a worn copy of Jane Eyre, the pages soft with repeated reading. "I know it's a woman's book," Jack said, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "But my sister loved it, read it at least a dozen times. After she died, I kept her books. This one's always been my favorite. Thought you might enjoy it." Sarah traced the embossed letters on the cover, touched beyond words. "Thank you. I've read it before, but it's been years. I'd forgotten how much I loved it." Jack pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, his hat balanced on his knee. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Sarah said honestly. "The pain isn't as bad, and I managed to eat breakfast without feeling sick." "That's good. Doc Miller seemed confident you'd make a full recovery as long as you follow his instructions and rest properly." They fell into an easy conversation then, the kind that felt natural despite the strangeness of their acquaintance. Jack told her about his work, about the freight routes he drove between Sacramento and the smaller mining towns scattered throughout the California foothills. He had a talent for storytelling, making even mundane deliveries sound interesting with his descriptions of the people he met and the landscapes he traveled through. "What brought you to Oroville?" Jack asked eventually, and Sarah felt herself tense. "I needed a fresh start," she said carefully. "My husband died recently, and there was nothing left for me in St. Louis." Jack was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him processing this information, weighing what to ask and what to leave unsaid. "I'm sorry for your loss," he finally said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure if he should be. "Don't be," Sarah replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "It's better that he's gone." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Jack didn't press for details, didn't ask the questions that were probably forming in his mind. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about Oroville and the surrounding area. "It's not a huge town, but it's growing," he said. "Used to be a mining town back in the 50s and 60s, during the gold rush. Most of the easy gold is gone now, but there's still some small-scale mining happening. These days, the town mostly serves the surrounding farms and ranches. Good people here, for the most part. Friendly, willing to help a neighbor in need." "It sounds nice," Sarah said. "Different from St. Louis. Quieter, certainly, though we get our share of excitement. Robberies like the one that got you aren't uncommon on these roads. Outlaws know the stages carry money and valuables, and there's a lot of empty country between towns where they can hide out." "Did they catch the men who robbed our stage?" Jack shook his head. "Sheriff Wilson sent out a posse, but they lost the trail in the hills." "Happens more often than not, unfortunately. These outlaws know the territory better than most lawmen." They talked for nearly an hour before Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway with lunch, an appointed look that suggested Jack had overstayed his welcome. He took the hint gracefully, standing and settling his hat back on his head. "I'll come by tomorrow if that's all right with you," he said to Sarah. "I'd like that," Sarah replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. After he left, Mrs. Henderson gave her a knowing smile. "That young man is quite taken with you, dear." "We barely know each other," Sarah protested weakly. "Sometimes that's all it takes. My husband proposed to me after knowing me for 2 weeks. We were married for 37 years before he passed, and I never regretted a single day of it, Mrs." Henderson set the lunch tray down. "Love doesn't always follow a schedule or make logical sense. Sometimes it just happens, quick as lightning and twice as powerful." Sarah ate her lunch in silence, thinking about Mrs. Henderson's words. She wasn't ready for love, wasn't sure she would ever be ready after everything Daniel had done to her. But there was something about Jack Anderson, something in the gentleness of his manner and the steadiness of his presence, that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. The days fell into a pattern. Jack visited every morning and evening, bringing books and conversation, sometimes just sitting quietly while Sarah rested. Mrs. Henderson changed her bandages twice daily, monitoring the wound for any signs of infection. Dr. Miller stopped by every few days to check on her progress, always professional and respectful, never asking about the scars he must have seen when treating her wound. By the end of the first week, Sarah was feeling well enough to sit up for longer periods, and she started helping Mrs. Henderson with small tasks around the boarding house, folding linens, mending clothes, peeling vegetables for dinner. Mrs. Henderson protested at first, but Sarah insisted. "I need to earn my keep," she said firmly, "and sitting in that room all day is driving me mad." "You're recovering from being shot," Mrs. Henderson pointed out. "No one expects you to work." "I expect it of myself," Sarah replied. "Besides, it helps to keep busy, gives me less time to think." Mrs. Henderson seemed to understand what Sarah wasn't saying, and she relented. So Sarah found herself in the boarding house kitchen, working alongside the older woman, learning the rhythms of the household. There were 3 other boarders besides Sarah, all men who worked in various capacities around town. They were polite and respectful, tipping their hats when they passed her in the hallway, complimenting the meals she helped prepare. Jack's freight run to Sacramento was postponed twice, first because of a problem with his wagon's axle, then because of a delay in the shipment he was supposed to deliver. Sarah knew he was losing money with each delay, but he never complained, never suggested that he needed to leave. Instead, he spent his days doing odd jobs around town, helping the blacksmith or the stable owner, earning enough to pay for his hotel room and meals. "You don't have to stay on my account," Sarah told him one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. She was feeling strong enough now to walk downstairs and sit outside for brief periods, though her shoulder still ached if she moved it too much. "I know I don't have to," Jack said, "but I want to. Is that all right?" Sarah looked at him, at the honest earnestness in his expression, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Yes," she said softly, "that's all right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night. Dogs barking, horses whinnying in the livery stable, someone playing a fiddle in one of the saloons down the street. "Tell me about your sister," Sarah said suddenly, "if you don't mind talking about it." Jack was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. But then he started speaking, his voice low and tinged with old grief. Her name was Jenny. She was 4 years younger than me, full of life and laughter, prettiest girl in our county, or so I thought. When she was 18, she married a man named Thomas Clark. He seemed like a good match, came from a respectable family, had a good job at the lumber yard. I was happy for her. He paused, his hands gripping the porch railing tightly. "I started driving freight that same year, needed to make more money to help support our parents. I'd be gone for weeks at a time, coming home when I could. Every time I saw Jenny, she seemed a little quieter, a little more withdrawn. But when I asked if everything was all right, she always said she was fine, just tired from keeping house." Sarah's heart ached, knowing where this story was heading. "It was our mother who finally told me the truth," Jack continued. "She'd gone to visit Jenny one day and found her with a black eye and bruises all over her arms. Jenny made her promise not to tell anyone, said Thomas was just having a hard time at work, that it was her fault for not being a better wife. Mother tried to convince her to leave, but Jenny was too scared." "What happened?" Sarah asked softly. "I came home for Christmas that year." Jenny didn't show up for dinner at our parents' house. Thomas said she was sick, but something felt wrong. I went to their house the next day and found her. She'd been beaten so badly she was barely conscious. I got her to a doctor, but it was too late. She died 2 days later. Internal bleeding, the doctor said. Nothing he could do. Jack's voice broke on the last words, and Sarah reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his on the railing. His fingers turned, grasping hers tightly. "I should have known," he said. "I should have seen the signs, should have protected her." "It wasn't your fault," Sarah said firmly. "The only person responsible for your sister's death was the man who hurt her. You couldn't have known. She hid it from you because she was ashamed, because he had broken her spirit so thoroughly that she believed his abuse was somehow her fault. I know, because that's exactly what my husband did to me." Jack turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "Is that why you wouldn't remove your dress for the doctor? Because of scars?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "May I ask how he died?" "Heart attack. Quick and painless, which is more than he deserved." The bitterness in Sarah's voice surprised even her. "I stood at his funeral and felt nothing but relief. Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Jack said fiercely. "It makes you a survivor. And I'm glad he's dead, because if he wasn't, I think I'd be tempted to kill him myself for what he did to you." The vehemence in his tone should have frightened her, but instead, Sarah felt only warmth, only gratitude for this man who barely knew her but was willing to defend her so completely. "I came west to start over," she said. "To become someone new, someone who isn't defined by what happened to me. But I'm beginning to think that maybe I don't need to become someone new. Maybe I just need to find people who can see me for who I really am, scars and all." Jack lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of respect and barely restrained emotion, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I see you, Sarah Hartwell," Jack said quietly. "And what I see is the strongest, bravest woman I've ever met. You survived hell and came out the other side still able to trust, still able to hope. That takes more courage than I think you realize." They sat together as the stars came out, hands clasped, two broken souls finding comfort in shared understanding. And for the first time since she could remember, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt hopeful. By the end of the second week, Sarah's shoulder had healed enough that Dr. Miller declared her out of danger. The stitches could stay in for another week, but she no longer needed daily bandage changes or constant supervision. She was free to move about as she pleased, though he cautioned her against any heavy lifting or strenuous activity. "You're a fortunate woman, Mrs. Hartwell, Doctor," Miller said as he packed up his medical bag for what would likely be his final visit. "That bullet could have done much more damage. Another few inches to the right, and it would have hit your lung." "I'm aware of how lucky I am, Doctor," Sarah replied. "Thank you for everything you've done for me." After he left, Sarah sat on her bed, contemplating her situation. She had been in Oroville for 2 weeks now, living off her savings and Mrs. Henderson's charity. It was time to start thinking about her future, about how she would support herself in this new town. She found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. "May I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" "I need to start earning money," Sarah said directly. "I can't continue to live off charity and my savings won't last forever. I was wondering if you might need help here at the boarding house. I could cook, clean, do laundry, whatever you need. I'm a hard worker and I learn quickly." Mrs. Henderson set down her paring knife and studied Sarah with shrewd eyes. "I could use the help, truth be told. Running this place by myself isn't easy anymore, not at my age. But are you sure you want to stay in Oroville? I thought your plan was to reach San Francisco." Plans change, Sarah said. I like it here. It's quiet, peaceful, and the people have been kind to me. I think I could build a good life here. Does this decision have anything to do with a certain freight driver? Mrs. Henderson asked with a knowing smile. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Perhaps, but even if it does, is that such a bad thing? Not at all, dear. I think it's wonderful. That young man has been mooning over you like a lovesick puppy for 2 weeks now. It's about time you admitted there might be something between you. I'm not ready for anything serious, Sarah said quickly. I enjoy his company. He makes me feel safe. And it's been a very long time since I felt safe with any man. Mrs. Henderson came around the table and pulled Sarah into a gentle hug, careful of her injured shoulder. You take all the time you need, dear. If Jack Anderson is half the man I think he is, he'll wait. Now about that job. I can offer you room, board, and $2 a week to start, more if business picks up. Does that sound fair? More than fair, Sarah agreed, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. You won't regret this. I know I won't. Now let's finish getting these vegetables ready. We've got hungry men to feed. That evening, Sarah told Jack about her new position at the boarding house. They were sitting on the porch again, their customary spot, watching the late summer evening fade into night. So you're staying in Oroville? Jack asked, and there was no hiding the hope in his voice. I'm staying, Sarah confirmed. At least for now. This town has been good to me. I'd like to give it a chance. I'm glad, Jack said simply. He was quiet for a moment, then added, I got word today that my freight shipment finally arrived in Sacramento. I need to head out tomorrow to pick it up and deliver it. I'll be gone for about a week. Sarah felt a pang of disappointment, though she tried not to let it show. Of course. You've already delayed your work too long on my account. Not on your account, Jack corrected gently. For you, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat, but I do need to get back to work. I've got bills to pay and a business to run. I understand. Jack reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. It had become a habit over the past 2 weeks, this casual touching, these small gestures of affection. Sarah had been frightened of it at first, her body remembering too well what men's hands could do. But Jack's touch was different, patient and gentle, never demanding more than she was ready to give. When I get back, Jack said carefully, I'd like to court you properly. Take you to dinner, maybe a church social if there's one happening. Let the whole town know that I'm interested in you if you'd be willing to accept my attentions. Sarah's heart was racing, but not with fear, with something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to joy. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. Jack's face broke into a wide grin, and Sarah found herself smiling back, genuinely smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. He leaned over and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, a chaste and tender gesture that somehow meant more than any passionate embrace could have. I'll come back, he promised. Count on it. He left early the next morning before the sun was fully up. Sarah watched from her window as he drove his freight wagon out of town, heading west toward Sacramento. The next week passed slowly, filled with work at the boarding house and quiet evenings on the porch with Mrs. Henderson. Sarah threw herself into her new duties with determination. She cooked and cleaned, changed linens and mended clothes, did laundry until her hands were red and raw. The work was hard but satisfying, and at the end of each day she fell into bed exhausted but content. This was honest work, work she was doing to support herself, not work done in fear of a husband's temper. The other boarders grew accustomed to her presence, greeting her warmly when they came in for meals, complimenting her cooking, treating her with respect and friendliness. Sarah began to feel like she was part of something, part of a community, in a way she had never experienced in St. Louis. On the 5th day of Jack's absence, a woman came to the boarding house looking for work. She was young, perhaps 20, with tired eyes and a baby on her hip. Mrs. Henderson hired her on the spot to help with the laundry, and Sarah found herself taking the younger woman under her wing, showing her the routines of the household, sharing tips for getting stains out of fabric, and making soap last longer. "Thank you for being so kind," the woman, whose name was Mary, said one afternoon as they hung sheets to dry in the yard behind the boarding house. "A lot of folks in town won't even look at me, on account of me having a baby and no husband." "Their judgment says more about them than it does about you," Sarah replied firmly. "You're working hard to support your child. There's no shame in that." Mary gave her a grateful smile. "Mrs. Henderson said you came here from back east. What brought you to California?" "I needed a fresh start," Sarah said, the answer she had given to everyone who asked. "Sometimes the only way to heal from the past is to leave it behind entirely." "I understand that," Mary said quietly. "I wish I could leave my past behind, but it follows me everywhere I go." Sarah thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. It was true that she had left St. Louis behind, had put physical distance between herself and the memories of her marriage to Daniel. But the scars remained, both physical and emotional. The past couldn't be erased simply by moving to a new place. But maybe, Sarah thought, the past didn't need to be erased. Maybe it just needed to be accepted, integrated into the person she was becoming. The scars were part of her story, but they didn't have to be the whole story. She could write new chapters, ones filled with friendship and honest work and maybe, just maybe, love. Jack returned on the 8th day, pulling his wagon into town just as the sun was setting. Sarah saw him from the boarding house window and felt her heart leap in her chest. She forced herself to finish setting the table for dinner, to act as though his return was nothing unusual, but Mrs. Henderson saw right through her. "Go on, dear," the older woman said with an amused smile. "Go say hello, dinner can wait 5 minutes." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She removed her apron, smoothed her hair, and stepped out onto the porch just as Jack was climbing down from his wagon. He saw her and stopped, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Hello, Sarah," he called out. "Welcome back," she replied, and then he was striding across the street, taking the porch steps 2 at a time, and before she quite knew what was happening, he had swept her into a careful hug, mindful of her still healing shoulder. "I missed you," he murmured against her hair. "I missed you too," Sarah admitted, and it was true. The week without him had felt longer than it should have, empty in a way that surprised her. They pulled apart, and Jack held her at arm's length, studying her face. "You look good, healthy, happy even." "I am happy," Sarah said, realizing as she said it that it was true. "I like it here. I like the work, the people. I like the person I'm becoming." "I like that person too," Jack said softly. "Very much. Now, didn't I promise to take you to dinner when I got back? Are you free tomorrow evening?" "I'll have to check with Mrs. Henderson, but I think so." "Good. There's a nice little restaurant on the other side of town, the Golden Rose. The owner's wife is an excellent cook. I'll come by around 6 to collect you if that's all right." Sarah nodded, feeling suddenly nervous and excited all at once. That sounds perfect. Their first proper date was everything Sarah could have hoped for. Jack arrived at the boarding house promptly at 6, dressed in clean pants and a pressed shirt, his hair neatly combed. He offered her his arm, and they walked through town together as the evening light painted everything gold. The Golden Rose was a small establishment, cozy and welcoming, with checkered tablecloths and oil lamps casting warm pools of light. The owner, a round man with a jolly manner, greeted Jack by name and showed them to a table by the window. "Your wife makes the best roasted chicken in California," Jack told the owner. "We'll have 2 plates and whatever vegetables she's serving tonight." As they waited for their food, Jack told Sarah about his trip to Sacramento, about the freight he had delivered and the new contracts he had secured for future runs. Sarah told him about the boarding house, about Mary and her baby, about the rhythm of her new life. "I've been thinking," Jack said as they ate, the roasted chicken every bit as delicious as he had promised. "I've been driving freight for years now, living out of hotel rooms and boarding houses, never staying in one place long enough to really put down roots. But I'm tired of that life. I want something more permanent, something stable." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster. "I'm saying I'm thinking about settling down in Oroville, maybe buying a small ranch outside of town, raising some cattle or horses. I could still do freight runs, but shorter ones, closer to home. It would mean a steadier income, a real home instead of just a place to sleep between jobs." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said sincerely. "You deserve to have a home, a place that's truly yours." Jack reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to build a life here, Sarah, and I hope when you're ready that you might consider building that life with me." Sarah's breath caught. It was too soon. She knew it was too soon. They had only known each other for 3 weeks, had only been on one proper date. But looking into Jack's eyes, seeing the honesty and hope there, she couldn't bring herself to dismiss his words out of hand. "I'm not ready for that yet," she said carefully. "The wounds from my marriage, they're still too fresh. I need time to heal, to figure out who I am outside of being someone's wife." "I understand," Jack said, and his expression was so gentle, so full of patient understanding that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just telling you what I'm thinking, what I'm hoping for. Take all the time you need. I'll be here." They finished their dinner in companionable silence, and Jack walked Sarah back to the boarding house as the stars came out overhead. At the door, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for a lovely evening," he said. "Thank you for dinner," Sarah replied. "And Jack, I'm hoping for the same things you are, I just need time." "Then time is what you'll have," he promised. The weeks turned into months, and summer faded into fall. Sarah continued working at the boarding house, and Jack made good on his plan to settle in Oroville. He bought a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town, 50 acres of grassland with a stream running through it, and a modest 2-room cabin that needed work. He spent his days fixing up the ranch, repairing the cabin's roof, building a new barn, clearing land for pasture. In the evenings, he would ride into town and visit Sarah, and they would sit on the boarding house porch talking until the stars came out. Sometimes he brought wildflowers he had picked on the ride in, sometimes fresh vegetables from his struggling garden, sometimes nothing but his company and his easy smile. Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Jack never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never demanded declarations of love or commitment. He was simply there, steady and constant, letting his actions speak louder than any words could. In October, Sarah's stitches finally came out, leaving a puckered scar on her shoulder that would fade with time but never disappear completely. Dr. Miller pronounced her fully healed, and Sarah celebrated by taking on more duties at the boarding house, including managing the accounts and ordering supplies. "You have a head for numbers," Mrs. Henderson observed one day as she watched Sarah tallying up the monthly expenses. "Did you learn that from your late husband?" "In a way," Sarah replied. "He handled all the money in our household, kept me on a strict allowance. But I learned to stretch every penny to make deals with shopkeepers, to find bargains wherever I could. I had to, if I wanted to have any money of my own hidden away." "Well, it served you well. This boarding house has turned a better profit in the past 3 months than it did in the previous year. You have a real talent for this." The praise warmed Sarah more than she expected. For so long, she had been told that she was worthless, useless, a burden. To hear that she had valuable skills, that she was contributing something meaningful, was a revelation. In November, Oroville held a harvest dance at the town hall. Jack invited Sarah to attend with him, and after getting Mrs. Henderson's approval for the evening off, she accepted. It would be the first time she had attended any kind of social gathering since arriving in California, and she was nervous. "What if people ask questions about my past?" she worried to Mrs. Henderson as the older woman helped her get ready, lending her a dress of deep blue that brought out the color of Sarah's eyes. "Then you tell them as much or as little as you want," Mrs. Henderson replied. "You don't owe anyone your story, dear. And anyone who pushes for details isn't worth your time." The dance was held in the town hall, a large building that also served as a church on Sundays. Someone had strung paper lanterns across the ceiling, and there was a small band in the corner playing lively folk tunes. The room was crowded with people, farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers, all dressed in their best clothes and eager for an evening of entertainment. Jack met Sarah at the door, his eyes widening appreciatively when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Sarah replied with a smile. He was wearing his best suit, a bit worn but clean and pressed, and he looked handsome in the lamplight. They danced several times, Jack's hand warm and steady on her waist, guiding her through the steps. Sarah was rusty at dancing, had not done it since before her marriage. But Jack was patient, leading her gently until the movements came back to her. Between dances, Jack introduced her to people around town. The blacksmith, the stable owner, the woman who ran the general store. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, accepting Sarah as Jack's companion without prying into her history. A few people asked where she was from, and she gave her standard answer about coming from St. Louis after her husband's death. No one pressed for more details. "You're quite the sensation," Jack murmured during a slower dance, pulling her a bit closer. "Half the men in this room have been asking me about you." "Oh," Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. "What do you tell them?" "That you're spoken for," Jack replied with a grin. "Even if you haven't officially agreed to be courted by me yet." Sarah laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. "You're very presumptuous, Mr. Anderson." "I prefer confident," he replied. Then, more seriously, "But if you want me to stop telling people that, I will. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "No," Sarah said softly. "I don't want you to stop, because it's true in a way. I might not be ready for everything that comes with being courted, but my heart, such as it is, it belongs to you, even if I'm still too scared to fully admit it." Jack's arms tightened around her, and he leaned down to rest his forehead against hers. "I'll wait as long as you need," he whispered. "Years, if that's what it takes. You're worth waiting for, Sarah Hartwell." The dance ended late, and Jack walked Sarah back to the boarding house under a sky full of stars. At the door, he hesitated, then leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Jack." Sarah went to bed that night with her heart full, more content than she had been in years. The nightmares still came sometimes, dreams of Daniel and his cruelty, but they were coming less frequently now. And when she woke from them, she could comfort herself with thoughts of Jack, of his kindness and patience, of the future they might build together. Winter came to Oroville, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain. Jack's ranch was progressing well, the cabin repaired and furnished with simple but sturdy furniture. He had bought a small herd of cattle and a few horses, and he was planning to expand in the spring. "I want you to see it," he told Sarah one Sunday afternoon in December. The ranch. I want you to see what I'm building, what could be our home someday, if you'll have me. Sarah agreed, and the following Sunday, Jack borrowed a wagon from the livery stable and drove her out to his property. The ranch was beautiful, nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance. The cabin was small but well built, with a fireplace and windows that let in plenty of light. There was a kitchen area, a bedroom, and a sitting area with a rocking chair Jack had made himself. "It's not fancy," Jack said, watching her nervously as she looked around. "But it's solid, and there's room to expand. I'm planning to add another bedroom or two, maybe a larger kitchen if there's ever a need for it." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. Room for children, for a family. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a cautious hope. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. "You've done an amazing job, Jack." They spent the afternoon at the ranch, and Jack showed her everything. The barn where he kept his horses and cattle, the vegetable garden he had planted that was lying dormant for the winter, the stream that provided fresh water year-round. He had plans for everything, for expanding the herd, for planting fruit trees, for building a proper chicken coop come spring. "I want to build something lasting," he explained as they stood by the stream, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "Something I can be proud of, something I can pass down to my children someday. I spent so many years drifting from place to place, never really belonging anywhere. But I belong here, and I want you to belong here too when you're ready." Sarah took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm almost ready," she said quietly. "I can feel it. The fear is still there, but it's not as strong as it used to be. You've helped me heal in ways I didn't think were possible." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You did the healing yourself," he said against her hair. "I just provided a safe place for you to do it." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the winter sun sink toward the horizon. When Jack finally drove Sarah back to town, she felt as though something had shifted inside her, some final barrier beginning to crumble. Christmas came, and Sarah spent it at the boarding house with Mrs. Henderson and the other boarders. Jack joined them for dinner, bringing gifts for everyone. For Mrs. Henderson, a beautiful shawl he had bought in Sacramento. For Mary, a toy carved wooden horse for her baby. And for Sarah, a book of poetry bound in soft leather. "I know how much you love to read," he said as she unwrapped it. "I saw this in a bookshop and thought of you." Sarah blinked back tears as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover. No one had given her such a thoughtful gift in years. Daniel had occasionally bought her things, but they had always been practical items, things she needed rather than things she wanted. This was different. This was something chosen with care, something meant to bring her joy. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's perfect." That evening, as they sat on the porch despite the winter chill, Sarah made a decision. She had been thinking about it for weeks, weighing her fears against her hopes, her past against her potential future, and she had finally reached a conclusion. "Jack," she said, turning to face him, "I want to tell you something, about my husband, about what he did to me." Jack's expression grew serious. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. I know, but I want to. I need to, because if we're going to have a future together, and I think we are, then you should know the truth. All of it." So Sarah told him. She told him about Daniel, about the charm that hid a monster, about the years of abuse that had left her covered in scars both visible and invisible. She told him about the fear, the shame, the desperate certainty that she would die at Daniel's hands. And she told him about the relief she had felt when he died, the guilt that had plagued her for feeling that way. Jack listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched and his hands fisted at his sides. "I'm glad he's dead," he finally said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "And I'm sorry that he's not alive so I could kill him myself for what he did to you. No one deserves to be treated that way." "I know that now," Sarah said, "but for a long time I believed it was my fault, that I had somehow earned his cruelty, that I deserved the pain." "You didn't," Jack said fiercely. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle despite the anger in his voice. "You didn't deserve any of it. You deserve to be cherished, protected, loved. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life showing you what real love looks like. I'll never raise a hand to you, never raise my voice in anger, never make you feel small or worthless. I swear it on my sister's memory." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "I believe you," she whispered, "and I'm ready now. Ready to move forward, ready to let myself love you the way you deserve to be loved." Jack pulled her into his arms, and they held each other as the winter stars wheeled overhead. And in that moment, Sarah felt the last of her fear fall away, replaced by something warm and bright and infinitely precious. Hope for the future, trust in the man who held her, and the beginning of a love that would last a lifetime. The new year of 1884 brought changes to Oroville and to Sarah's life. In January, Jack formally asked Sarah to marry him, presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. They were sitting on the porch of his ranch house, wrapped in blankets against the winter cold, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I know it's not much," Jack said as he held out the ring, "but it was my mother's, and she wore it for 40 years of happy marriage to my father. I'd be honored if you'd wear it now." Sarah took the ring with trembling hands, sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been meant for her all along. "I'd be honored to be your wife," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They decided on a spring wedding, giving Sarah time to prepare and to make sure she was truly ready for this step. Mrs. Henderson was thrilled, immediately offering to host the ceremony at the boarding house and to bake the wedding cake herself. Mary, who had become a dear friend, offered to help Sarah make her wedding dress. The months between the engagement and the wedding were filled with preparation and joy. Sarah continued working at the boarding house, saving her wages to buy household items for the ranch. Jack worked on expanding the cabin, adding a second bedroom and a larger kitchen, wanting everything to be perfect for his bride. They spent every spare moment together, talking about their plans for the future, learning each other's hopes and dreams. Jack told Sarah about his desire to build the ranch into something substantial, something that could support a family. Sarah told him about her dream of opening a small shop in town someday, selling fabric and sewing supplies, teaching other women the skills her mother had taught her. "We'll make all of it happen," Jack promised. "Together." In March, Sarah received an unexpected letter from St. Louis. It was from Daniel's lawyer, informing her that the sale of Daniel's house and business assets had been finalized. As his widow, she was entitled to her share of the estate. The amount was substantial, far more than Sarah had expected. "This changes everything," she told Jack, showing him the letter. "With this money, we could expand the ranch, buy more cattle, maybe even hire some help." "That's your money," Jack said firmly, "from your life before. You should do with it whatever you want." Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled. "I want to invest it in our future, half into the ranch to make it prosperous, and half into opening that shop I told you about. What do you say? Partners in everything?" Jack grinned and pulled her into a kiss. "Partners in everything," he agreed. The wedding took place on a beautiful April morning, with wildflowers blooming across the valley and the sky a perfect cloudless blue. Sarah wore a dress of ivory silk that she and Mary had spent weeks making, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was pinned up with small flowers, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Jack had picked that morning. The ceremony was held in the boarding house parlor, with Dr. Miller officiating since he was also a justice of the peace. Mrs. Henderson and Mary stood as witnesses, and several people from town attended, filling the small room to capacity. Jack stood at the front of the room in his best suit, and when Sarah entered, his face lit up with such love and joy that she felt her heart might burst from happiness. They exchanged vows, traditional words that took on new meaning in Sarah's mind. To love and to cherish, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. But unlike her first marriage, Sarah knew these vows would be honored. Jack would cherish her, would love her through good times and bad. And she would do the same for him, would build a life with him based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Jack slipped the wedding band onto her finger, next to the engagement ring, Sarah felt tears of joy running down her face. And when the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, Jack's kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise for the future. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a feast, and there was music and dancing in the boarding house parlor. People from town brought gifts, practical things like dishes and linens and tools for the ranch. Sarah danced with her new husband, feeling light and free in a way she had never experienced before. As the sun began to set, Jack and Sarah left the boarding house in his wagon, heading for the ranch that was now their home. Their friends and neighbors lined the street, waving and calling out good wishes as they passed. At the ranch, Jack carried Sarah over the threshold of the cabin, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. He set her down gently in the main room, which glowed with lamplight and the warmth of the fireplace. "Welcome home, Mrs. Anderson," Jack said softly. "It feels right," Sarah replied, looking around the cabin that Jack had worked so hard to prepare. "Being here with you, it feels like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." That night, for the first time in her life, Sarah experienced what love should be. Jack was patient and gentle, constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. There was no pain, no force, no fear, only tenderness and care and a growing passion that left them both breathless. Afterward, lying in Jack's arms with her head on his chest, Sarah felt a peace she had never known. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Jack asked, his fingers running gently through her hair. "For showing me what love really is, for being patient with me, for giving me time to heal, for being everything Daniel wasn't." Jack pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I should be thanking you. For trusting me, for giving me a chance to prove that not all men are like your first husband, for letting me love you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Sarah slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, but a joyful one. Sarah learned the rhythms of ranch life, helping Jack tend the cattle and horses, maintaining the vegetable garden, preserving food for the winter. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done at the boarding house, but it was satisfying in a way that work had never been before. She was building something with her own hands, creating a life that belonged to her and Jack. In the summer, they used part of Sarah's inheritance to buy more cattle and to hire a ranch hand, a young man named Tom who was hardworking and respectful. With Tom's help, Jack was able to expand operations, taking on freight jobs in addition to managing the ranch. In the fall, Sarah opened her shop in town, a small storefront next to the general store. She called it the Fabric House, and she sold cloth, thread, needles, and other sewing supplies. She also offered services as a seamstress and gave lessons to women who wanted to learn to sew. The shop was an immediate success. Women from town and the surrounding ranches came to buy supplies and to socialize, and Sarah found that she had a real talent for business. Within a few months, she was turning a steady profit and had to order additional inventory to keep up with demand. "I'm proud of you," Jack told her one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set. "You've built something real, something all your own." "We've built it together," Sarah corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you, without your support and encouragement." Their life settled into a comfortable pattern. Jack managed the ranch and did occasional freight runs, while Sarah ran her shop and kept the household. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, talking about their day, making plans for the future. On Sundays, they would attend church in town, then have dinner with Mrs. Henderson and Mary, who had become like family. In the spring of 1885, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mixture of joy and fear. She was thrilled at the prospect of having a child with Jack, but memories of her mother's difficult pregnancies and her own fears about motherhood made her anxious. Jack was nothing but supportive, treating Sarah as though she were made of glass, constantly worried about her health and comfort. "I've already lost one woman I loved," he told her. "I can't lose you too." "You won't," Sarah assured him. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'll be fine." Dr. Miller confirmed the pregnancy and declared Sarah healthy and strong. "Based on my calculations, you should expect the baby to arrive in early December," he said. "Make sure you rest plenty and eat well, and call for me at the first sign of labor." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Sarah continued to work at her shop through the summer and into the fall, though she eventually had to hire a young woman named Lily to help, as her belly grew too large to comfortably reach the cutting table. Jack fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more, eat more, do less strenuous work around the ranch. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Sarah told him with amusement after he tried to prevent her from hanging laundry. "Women have been doing chores throughout pregnancy for centuries." "Not my wife," Jack replied stubbornly. "You're carrying our child. That's the most important job you could be doing. Everything else can wait." In late November, Sarah closed her shop for the winter, planning to reopen in the spring after the baby was born. She spent her days preparing the nursery in the cabin's second bedroom, sewing tiny clothes, knitting blankets, and daydreaming about what their child would be like. Labor began on a cold night in early December, just as Dr. Miller had predicted. Jack rode into town through the darkness to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, who had offered to assist with the birth. Sarah labored through the night and into the following morning, with Jack pacing anxiously in the main room of the cabin while Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Miller attended to her. The pain was intense, worse than anything Sarah had experienced, but she bore it with determination. She had survived so much already, had overcome so much pain and fear. She could do this too. Finally, as the sun was rising over the mountains, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Dr. Miller cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a blanket before handing him to Sarah, who cradled her son with tears streaming down her face. "He's perfect," she whispered, studying the tiny face, the small fingers that gripped her thumb. Jack was called in and he approached the bed with something like awe on his face. "A son," he breathed. "We have a son." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, "James, after my father. James Henry Anderson, if you agree." "It's perfect," Sarah said. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world." The first months of James's life were exhausting but wonderful. Sarah had never been happier, despite the sleepless nights and constant demands of an infant. Jack was a devoted father, helping with feedings, changing diapers, walking the floor with James when he was fussy. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Jack said one night as he held his sleeping son. Looking at him, "I understand why you were so scared when you were pregnant. If anything happened to you, I don't think I could survive it." "Nothing is going to happen to any of us," Sarah said firmly. "We're a family now and we'll protect each other. Always." As James grew, the ranch prospered. Jack's herd expanded, and he hired additional ranch hands to help manage the increased workload. Sarah reopened her shop in the spring, bringing James with her and setting up a cradle in the back room where he could sleep while she worked. The people of Oroville had fully accepted Sarah and Jack as part of their community. No one asked any more about Sarah's past or where she had come from. She was simply Sarah Anderson, Jack's wife, James's mother, proprietor of the successful fabric house. The person she had been in St. Louis, the frightened woman who had endured years of abuse, felt like a distant memory. But the scars remained, physical reminders of what she had survived. Sometimes Jack would trace them gently with his fingers as they lay together in the darkness, and Sarah would feel a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for what she had endured, gratitude that she had survived, and love for the man who had helped her heal. "Do they bother you?" she asked Jack one night. "The scars. They break my heart," Jack replied honestly. "But not because they're ugly or because they change how I feel about you. They break my heart because they represent pain you should never have had to endure. But they're also a testament to your strength, to the fact that you survived and came out the other side still capable of love and trust. So no, they don't bother me. They're part of you, and I love every part of you." In the summer of 1887, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less anxious, more confident in her body's ability to carry and deliver a healthy child. Their second child, a daughter they named Emily Rose Anderson, was born the following February. She had Jack's blue-gray eyes and Sarah's dark hair, and from the moment she entered the world, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. James grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved helping his father on the ranch. Emily was a gentle, sweet-natured child who preferred sitting with her mother in the fabric shop, watching the women who came and went, eventually learning to thread needles and sew simple stitches. In 1890, their third child was born, another son they named Thomas William Anderson. Tom, as he would be called, was the most adventurous of the three children, always climbing trees and chasing after the ranch animals, giving his parents constant heart attacks with his fearless nature. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in the area. Jack's reputation as an honest, hard-working rancher spread throughout the county, and he was often asked for advice by newer settlers. Sarah's shop had expanded to include a section for millinery supplies, and she had trained 3 young women to work alongside her, teaching them the skills her mother had once taught her. Through all of it, Sarah and Jack's love for each other only deepened. They had built something lasting, something real, from the ashes of Sarah's painful past and Jack's grief over his sister. They had created a family, a home, a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Jack surprised Sarah by taking her back to Oroville, to the boarding house where they had first met. Mrs. Henderson, now in her late 60s and semi-retired, greeted them with tears and hugs. "Look at you two," she said, beaming. 10 years married and still looking at each other like newlyweds. You've done well for yourselves." They had dinner at the boarding house, reminiscing about those early days when Sarah was recovering from her gunshot wound and Jack had stood outside the door, promising to protect her, telling her to take her time. It felt like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to different people entirely. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked Jack that evening as they walked through town under the stars. Taking a chance on a broken woman with more baggage than most people carry in a lifetime. Jack stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You were never broken," he said firmly. "Hurt, yes, scared, absolutely, but never broken. And you were worth every moment of patience, every ounce of care. You gave me a family, Sarah. You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me love. I could never regret that." Sarah stood on her toes and kissed him, right there in the middle of the street, not caring who might see. "I love you, Jack Anderson. Thank you for saving my life." "Thank you for letting me," Jack replied softly. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as life always does. Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1896, leaving the boarding house to Sarah in her will. Sarah couldn't bear to sell it, so she hired a manager to run it, and the building continued to serve as a welcoming place for travelers and new arrivals to Oroville. Mary, who had become Sarah's closest friend, married a kind farmer and had 3 more children to go with the son she had when she first arrived in Oroville. Tom, the ranch hand who had been with Jack since the early days, eventually married and bought his own small ranch nearby, remaining a close friend and frequent dinner guest. Sarah's children grew up healthy and happy, never knowing the kind of fear and pain their mother had endured in her first marriage. James eventually took over much of the ranch's operations, working alongside his father. Emily opened her own business in town, a bakery that quickly became famous throughout the county. Young Tom, true to his adventurous nature, joined the army and sent letters home full of stories about his travels. In 1903, nearly 20 years after that fateful day when Sarah was shot and brought to Oroville, Sarah and Jack celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with their children, grandchildren, and friends gathered at the ranch. The cabin had been expanded over the years into a proper house, with multiple bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a wraparound porch where they still sat every evening, watching the sun set over the mountains. As Sarah looked around at the gathering, at the family she and Jack had built together, at the life they had created from pain and loss and unexpected kindness, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She thought about the frightened woman she had been on that stagecoach, bleeding and terrified, convinced she was going to die. She thought about Jack, standing outside the door of the boarding house room, telling her to take her time, promising to protect her even though she was a stranger. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, coming to stand beside her on the porch, his arm slipping around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Sarah replied, leaning into his embrace. "About how one moment of kindness from a stranger changed my entire life. About how you gave me everything I never knew I needed or deserved." Jack pressed a kiss to her temple. "You deserved it all always. You just needed someone to show you that." "You did more than show me," Sarah said. "You gave me time to heal, space to become myself again. You never pushed, never demanded more than I could give. You stood outside that door and told me to take my time, and you've been doing that ever since. Giving me time, giving me patience, giving me love." "And I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat," Jack replied. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I'd choose you every single time." As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah and Jack stood together on the porch they had built, surrounded by the life they had created. The scars on Sarah's body had faded with time, though they never fully disappeared. But they were just marks now, reminders of where she had been, not indicators of who she was. She was Sarah Anderson, beloved wife, devoted mother, successful businesswoman, pillar of the Oroville community. She was a woman who had survived the worst kind of pain and come out the other side stronger, kinder, more determined to build a life worth living. And she was loved, deeply and completely, by a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen to protect rather than exploit, to heal rather than harm, to wait rather than demand. Their story had begun with a bullet and a refusal, with fear and scars and carefully guarded secrets. But it had grown into something beautiful, something lasting, something that would echo through generations as their children and grandchildren told the story of how their grandparents met, fell in love, and built an empire from nothing but determination and devotion. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack and Sarah went inside to join their family, ready to celebrate 20 years of marriage and a lifetime of love. The journey had been long, the road sometimes difficult, but they had traveled it together, hand in hand, partners in everything. And in the end, that made all the difference. The years after their 20th anniversary continued to bring both challenges and triumphs, as life always does. Sarah watched with pride as her children built their own lives, made their own choices, and created their own families. James married a schoolteacher from Sacramento named Alice, and they gave Sarah and Jack their first grandchildren, twin girls named Sarah and Jennifer after their grandmother and great-aunt. The twins were born in 1905, and Sarah cried when she first held them, thinking about how far she had come from that terrified woman on the stagecoach. Emily married a banker from Oroville named Robert Harrison, and they had 3 children in quick succession. Sarah delighted in watching Emily navigate motherhood with confidence and joy, so different from Sarah's own anxious early days with James. Emily had never known fear or abuse, had grown up secure in her parents' love, and it showed in every aspect of her life. Young Tom, after his military service ended in 1908, returned to Oroville and surprised everyone by announcing he was going to study law. He attended school in San Francisco and eventually opened a practice in Oroville, becoming the town's most sought-after lawyer. He married late, at 35, to a widow with 2 children of her own, and they had one more child together, a daughter they named Margaret. As Sarah entered her 50s, she began to think about slowing down, perhaps selling the fabric shop and spending more time at the ranch with Jack. But she found she couldn't quite let go of the business she had built from nothing. Instead, she trained Emily's eldest daughter, Catherine, to eventually take over the shop, passing on the skills and knowledge she had accumulated over the years. Jack, meanwhile, had become one of the most respected ranchers in the county. His operation was now substantial, employing over a dozen men and supplying beef to markets as far away as San Francisco and Sacramento. But despite his success, he never lost the humility and kindness that had first drawn Sarah to him. On a warm summer evening in 1913, 30 years after their first meeting, Sarah and Jack sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Their children were grown, their grandchildren numerous and thriving. The ranch was prosperous, the shop was successful, and their life together had exceeded any dreams either of them had dared to have. "You remember that day when I told you about my sister?" Jack asked, his hand finding Sarah's in the gathering dusk. "When I explained why I couldn't just walk away and let you die in that boarding house room?" "I remember," Sarah said softly. "You said you hadn't been there for Jenny, but you could be there for me." "I've been thinking about her a lot lately," Jack admitted. wondering what her life might have been like if she had survived, if she had found the courage to leave her husband and start over somewhere new, like you did. "She'd be proud of you," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "For the life you've built, for the way you've honored her memory by helping me when I needed it most." "I like to think she brought us together," Jack said. "That somehow her spirit guided me to that boarding house on that specific day, gave me the words to say to convince you to accept help. I couldn't save her, but maybe she helped me save you." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Then I owe her everything. My life, my happiness, my children and grandchildren. All of it exists because you had the compassion and patience to give a frightened woman time to heal." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled for the night, the horses dozing in the barn. From inside the house came the sound of their granddaughter Catherine practicing the piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows. "I want to do something," Sarah said suddenly. "Something to honor Jenny's memory and to help other women who might be in the situation I was in, or that she was in." "What did you have in mind?" Jack asked. "I want to open a shelter," Sarah explained, the idea forming even as she spoke. "A place where women who are being abused can come for help. Somewhere safe, where they won't be judged or turned away. We could use the boarding house. It's sitting mostly empty now anyway, with the manager only keeping a few rooms occupied. We could turn it into a place of refuge." Jack was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he nodded. "I think that's a wonderful idea, and I think Jenny would love it. What would you call it?" "Jenny's Haven," Sarah said without hesitation. "In memory of your sister and in hope for all the women who need a safe place to heal." Over the next year, Sarah and Jack transformed the old boarding house into Jenny's Haven. They hired staff, including a nurse and a cook, and spread the word through churches and doctors' offices that there was a place where women could go if they needed help. The response was overwhelming. Within the first few months, they had helped a dozen women escape abusive situations, providing them with shelter, medical care, and assistance in starting new lives. Sarah worked tirelessly at the Haven, drawing on her own experiences to help the women who came through its doors. She understood their fear, their shame, their reluctance to accept help, and she could offer them something that few others could: proof that it was possible to survive, to heal, to build a new life after abuse. One woman in particular stood out to Sarah. Her name was Claire, and she arrived at Jenny's Haven in the fall of 1914 with 2 small children and injuries that made Sarah's blood boil. Claire's husband was a prominent businessman in Sacramento, and she had been suffering his abuse for 7 years. "I tried to leave before," Claire told Sarah one evening as they sat in the Haven's kitchen, the children asleep upstairs. "But he always found me. He said he'd kill me and take the children if I ever tried again." "You're safe here," Sarah assured her. "And we're going to help you start over somewhere he can't find you. It's possible, Claire. I did it, and so can you." Sarah told Claire her own story, something she rarely did with the women at the Haven. She showed her the faded scars that remained on her back and sides, physical evidence of what she had survived. And she introduced Claire to her children and grandchildren, living proof that it was possible to build a beautiful life after escaping abuse. Claire stayed at the Haven for 3 months, recovering physically and emotionally. With Sarah and Jack's help, she secured a divorce, got a job as a clerk in a shop in Oroville, and found a small house to rent for herself and her children. Years later, she would tell people that Sarah Anderson had saved her life, just as Jack had saved Sarah's all those years ago. As Sarah approached her 60th birthday in 1918, she began to think about her legacy. She had built a successful business, raised wonderful children, helped establish a safe haven for abused women. But most importantly, she had survived. She had taken the broken pieces of her first life and created something beautiful from them. On her birthday, her children threw her a surprise party at the ranch. The house was filled with children, grandchildren, friends from town, women she had helped at Jenny's Haven. As Sarah looked around at all the faces, at all the lives that had been touched by her story, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Jack found her standing alone on the porch, taking a moment to herself away from the celebration. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy birthday, my love," he murmured. "Thank you for all of this," Sarah said, gesturing to the house full of people. "For this life, for these years, for never giving up on me even when I had given up on myself." "I saw something in you that day at the boarding house," Jack said. "Even through the pain and fear, I could see your strength, your resilience. I knew if you could just find the courage to accept help, to give yourself time to heal, you would become exactly what you are now, an incredible woman who has touched countless lives." "We did it together," Sarah corrected. "You gave me the time I needed. You stood outside that door and told me to take my time, and you've been doing it ever since. Giving me time, giving me space, giving me patience and love. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They stood together as the sun set, as they had done thousands of times over the 35 years of their marriage. Inside, their family waited, ready to celebrate Sarah's birthday and the remarkable life she had built. But for this moment, it was just the two of them, the freight driver and the frightened woman he had saved, the husband and wife who had built an empire of love and kindness from the ashes of tragedy. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the natural progression of life. Sarah and Jack grew older, their hair turning white, their bodies slowing down. They both eventually retired, Jack turning the ranch over to James and Sarah passing the fabric shop to her granddaughter Catherine. But they remained active in the community, particularly with Jenny's Haven, which had expanded to include job training and legal assistance for the women it served. In 1923, 40 years after that fateful meeting at the boarding house, Sarah and Jack celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a grand celebration, inviting people from all over California. Over 200 people attended, testament to the impact Sarah and Jack had made on their community. During the celebration, Sarah's son Tom, the lawyer, stood to give a toast. "My parents' story is one that has inspired me my entire life," he said. "They met during one of the darkest moments of my mother's life. She had been shot, she was scared, and she refused medical help because she was too traumatized by her past to trust anyone. But my father saw past her fear to the incredible woman underneath. He stood outside that door and told her to take her time, and he's been giving her that same patience and love every day since." Tom raised his glass. "To my parents, Jack and Sarah Anderson. Thank you for showing us what real love looks like, for teaching us that it's never too late to start over, and for proving that kindness and patience can heal even the deepest wounds. May you have many more years together." The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Sarah felt Jack's hand find hers under the table, their fingers interlocking in the familiar gesture that had become second nature over 4 decades together. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Sarah and Jack found themselves alone on the ranch porch once again, watching the stars emerge in the twilight sky. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden Sarah had planted years ago. 40 years, Sarah mused. It seems impossible that it's been that long. "Best 40 years of my life," Jack replied. "Every single day with you has been a gift, Even the hard days, Sarah asked with a slight smile. The days when I woke up screaming from nightmares. The days when I couldn't bear to be touched because the memories were too strong. Even those days, Jack confirmed. Because on those days I got to show you that not all men are like the one who hurt you. I got to prove that love doesn't have to come with pain. And I got to watch you grow stronger, braver, more confident. Those days were hard, but they were also important. They were part of our journey together. Sarah leaned her head on Jack's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. I never thanked you properly for that day at the boarding house. When I refused to remove my dress for the doctor, and you stood outside that door and told me to take my time. You didn't know me, had no reason to care what happened to me, but you cared anyway. I could not care, Jack said simply. I saw a woman in pain, desperately in need of help but too frightened to accept it. I saw my sister in you and I couldn't walk away. And then, as I got to know you, I saw so much more. I saw intelligence, determination, kindness. I saw a woman worth fighting for, worth waiting for. You changed my life that day, Sarah whispered. You saved it, literally and figuratively. Because of your patience, your willingness to give me time and space to heal, I got to live this incredible life. I got to be loved the right way, to raise children without fear, to help other women find the same healing I found. All of that exists because you cared enough to stand outside that door and tell me to take my time. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had spent 40 years learning each other, loving each other, building a life together from the broken pieces of their pasts. Around them, the ranch breathed with live cattle lowing softly in the distance, horses moving restlessly in the barn, crickets beginning their evening chorus. You know what my favorite part of our life together is? Jack asked suddenly. What's that? This. Right here. Sitting on this porch with you, watching the sunset, knowing that tomorrow we'll wake up and do it all again. The big moments have been wonderful: our wedding, the birth of our children, the successes we've achieved. But these quiet moments, just the two of us together, these are the ones I treasure most. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes, the happy kind that came from being so overwhelmed with love and gratitude that her heart couldn't contain it all. I love you, Jack Anderson. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. I love you too, Sarah. Always have, always will. As they stood to go inside, Sarah paused at the doorway, looking back at the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. This porch had been witness to countless conversations, shared dreams, solved problems, and quiet companionship. It had been the backdrop for their love story, the place where they reconnected at the end of each day. You know, Sarah said thoughtfully, if someone had told that frightened woman in the boarding house that 40 years later she would be standing here, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having built a successful business and a shelter for women in need, all because a kind freight driver gave her the time and space to heal, I wouldn't have believed them. Life has a funny way of working out, Jack agreed, wrapping his arm around her waist. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. That robbery that got you shot, that was terrible, but it brought you to Oroville to me, and look at everything that came from that. They went inside together, closing the door on another perfect evening. In the years that followed, Sarah and Jack continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by their growing family. They watched their grandchildren grow up, get married, have children of their own. They saw Jenny's Haven expand to serve women across 3 counties, helping hundreds of women escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. Jack passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1931, at the age of 78. He had been working on the ranch until just weeks before his death, still vital and engaged with life. Sarah was devastated by his loss, but she took comfort in knowing that they had had 48 years together, nearly half a century of love and partnership. At Jack's funeral, held at the ranch he had built from nothing, Sarah stood before the assembled crowd of family and friends and shared their story one last time. She told them about the day they met, about how she had refused to remove her dress for the doctor, about how Jack had stood outside that door and promised to protect her, telling her to take her time. "Jack Anderson saved my life that day," Sarah said, her voice strong despite her grief. "But more than that, he gave me a reason to want to live. He showed me what real love looked like, what real strength was. He was patient when I needed patience, gentle when I needed gentleness, strong when I needed strength. He was everything a partner should be, and I am grateful for every single day I got to spend with him." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, friends, neighbors, women she had helped at Jenny's Haven. Jack believed that small acts of kindness could change lives. He proved it by standing outside that door, by giving a frightened woman the time she needed to heal. And in doing so, he didn't just change my life. He changed all of yours too, because none of you would be here without him. His legacy lives on in every person in this gathering, in every woman who finds safety at Jenny's Haven, in every act of kindness we choose to perform because we learned from his example. Sarah lived for another 12 years after Jack's death, continuing to work with Jenny's Haven and spending time with her ever-growing family. She filled her days with purpose and love, carrying Jack's memory with her in everything she did. She told their story often to her great-grandchildren, to women at the Haven, to anyone who would listen. When Sarah passed away in 1943 at the age of 84, she died surrounded by family in the ranch house she and Jack had built together. Her last words were, "Tell Jack I'm coming," and there was a smile on her face as she closed her eyes for the final time. At her funeral, held on that same ranch porch where she and Jack had spent so many evenings, her grandson Paul shared the story that had become family legend. The story of a frightened woman who refused to remove her dress, and a kind cowboy who stood outside the door and said, "Take your time." He told how that simple act of patience and respect had blossomed into a love story for the ages, how two broken people had found healing in each other, how they had built not just a family, but a legacy of kindness and compassion. Jenny's Haven continued to operate for decades after Sarah's death, eventually expanding into a network of shelters throughout California. Sarah's great-great-granddaughter would eventually write a book about Sarah and Jack's story, bringing their message of hope and healing to an even wider audience. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Jack and Sarah had built. The porch where they had sat so many evenings became a gathering place for family reunions, a spot where couples would sit and watch the sunset, following in the footsteps of the two people who had started it all. And through it all, through every generation, through every retelling of the story, the message remained the same: that kindness matters, that patience can heal even the deepest wounds, that love, real, honest, respectful love, has the power to transform lives. Sarah Hartwell had boarded a stagecoach in St. Louis in 1883, a frightened widow carrying scars both visible and invisible, with no idea where her journey would lead. That journey had brought her to Oroville, to a boarding house room where she lay bleeding and terrified, to a moment of decision where she had to choose between dying with her secrets intact or living with the risk of exposure. And it had brought her to Jack Anderson, a freight driver with a tragic past and a heart full of compassion, who had looked at her fear and pain and chosen kindness. who had stood outside that door and given her the gift of time, of patience, of respect. From that single moment of grace, an entire legacy had been born, a marriage that lasted nearly 50 years. 3 children, 11 grandchildren, 23 great-grandchildren, and countless more descendants who would never have existed without Jack's decision to care, without Sarah's courage to accept help and healing. A successful business that provided employment and services to the community. A shelter that saved hundreds of lives. A model of what real love could look like, built on a foundation of patience, respect, and mutual care. All of it traced back to that August day in 1883, to a cowboy standing outside a door, telling a frightened woman to take her time. It was a small act in many ways, a simple gesture of human decency. But from small acts, great things can grow. From moments of kindness, entire lives can change. And so the story of Jack and Sarah Anderson lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that it's never too late to start over, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest words. Take your time. Their graves sat side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath 2 oak trees they had planted together decades earlier. The headstones were simple, listing their names and dates, but to the family and community they left behind, they represented so much more. They represented hope, healing, and the transformative power of love given freely and without condition. And on summer evenings, when the sun set over the California mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their descendants would gather on that old ranch porch. They would tell stories of Jack and Sarah, of how they met and fell in love, of the life they built together. And always, the story would come back to that moment in the boarding house, to the refusal and the response, to the fear and the kindness that overcame it. She refused to remove her dress, they would say. Even for the doctor, she was too scared, too hurt by what had been done to her. But the cowboy, our grandfather Jack, he understood. He stood outside that door and said, "Take your time," and he meant it. He gave her all the time she needed to heal, to learn to trust again, to believe that she deserved love and respect. And from that patience, from that simple act of human decency, everything we have today was born. The story never got old. Each generation found new meaning in it, new lessons to apply to their own lives. And through it all, the legacy of Jack and Sarah Anderson endured, a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of patience, and the incredible things that can happen when broken people find each other and choose to heal together. In the end, that was their greatest gift, not the ranch or the business or even the shelter, as important as those things were. Their greatest gift was the proof that it was possible to survive the worst life could throw at you and still build something beautiful on the other side. That love didn't have to hurt, that patience was a virtue worth practicing, and that taking the time to heal was never time wasted. She had refused to remove her dress, and he had stood outside and told her to take her time. From that moment, everything else had followed, a love story that spanned 5 decades, a family that grew to touch hundreds of lives, and a legacy that would endure for generations to come. All because one man chose kindness, and one woman found the courage to accept it. And that, in the end, made all the difference.